Welcome everyone to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Jennifer Entwistle and I am the co-director of the festival. And this is our 16th year of bringing authors and readers together. It's actually our biggest year so far. We've had over 100 panelists joining us this weekend, which means there's something for everyone. So we've had a full day today and we're going to have another full day tomorrow. So if this is the first time you're tuning in, definitely check out our website because I'm sure there's something you're going to want to see on Sunday. We are using Zoom webinar, which means that you will be able to see and hear the panelists, but we cannot see and hear the audience. So I do invite you to use the chat window throughout the session. You can have plenty of discussion over there. But if you have a question for the authors, please use the Q&A button that's on the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. That's the tool we'll be using when we move to Q&A towards the end of this event. And lastly, I want to mention that this is Independent Bookseller Day. So we do encourage you to please purchase your books from an independent bookseller. We have two fabulous bookstores that we partner with, Jabberwocky Bookshop here in Newburyport, as well as the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. They are ready, willing, and able to take your orders. But if you have a favorite local bookstore, then we encourage you to buy all your books there. Local bookstores need our support now more than ever. So let's make sure we're keeping them alive. Now, we've got a great panel lined up for you today. So I want to introduce our authors. Fiona Davis is the New York Times best-selling author of historical novels set in iconic New York City buildings, including The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. She began her career in New York City as an actress, but after getting a master's degree at Columbia Journalism School, she fell in love with writing. She's based in New York City. Dolen Perkins-Valdez is the author of the New York Times best-selling novel, Wench. The book was a finalist for 2 NAACP Image Awards and the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Fiction. Dolen's forthcoming novel is If This Is Peace, will be published by Berkeley Books in 2022. Dolan is the current chair of the board of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. She's associate professor in the literature department at the American University and lives in Washington, D.C. with her family. Alyson Richman is the #1 international best-selling author of 7 novels, including The Lost Wife, which is currently in development for a major motion picture. Alyson spent her childhood in both Long Island and Japan and graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. She lives on Long Island, where she is currently at work on her next novel, The Minutes Home. And we have MJ Rose. She has published more than 19 novels and 3 books on marketing. She's been published in more than 30 countries and sold over 1.5 million books. The Fox TV news show Past Lives was based on Rose's novel, The Reincarnationist. MJ graduated from Syracuse University and spent the 80s in advertising, and she has a commercial in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. So welcome to all of our panelists, and Fiona, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everybody for joining us today to talk about stories from Suffragette City. Here's the book. It came out last autumn. And what it is, it's a collection of short stories. And I just want to read off the names of all of the authors who've contributed to it, so we make sure everybody gets a shout out. It includes Paula McLean, Christina Baker-Klein, Chris Bojalian, Megan Chance, Jamie Ford, Alyson Richman, Lisa Wingate, Dolen Perkins-Valdez, Catherine J. Chen, and Steve Berry, and it has an introduction by Kristen Hanna. So that's the book we're talking about today. And MJ and I are both co-editors on it. So I thought I'd start by letting MJ lead off onto how we came up with the idea for this book.
Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction, and hi to everybody who's here. We're so happy to see you, even if it's virtually and we can only see your names. So the way this book happened was Fiona and I went to Minnesota to do a book event. And when it was over, it was a very windy morning, and the hotel called and said that we had to go to the airport extremely early. So we went to the airport 3 hours early, and the airport is a little tiny airport and there's nothing to do. And so we got coffee and we sat down and we started talking. And I always joke around and say, leave 2 authors together for 3 extra hours. And what they start doing is coming up with a book. So we started talking about doing an anthology together that was sort of inspired by, I was telling Fiona that a friend of mine, whose name is Meredith Bergman, had just been awarded the commission to build the first statue of ever living women in Central Park. So let me explain that a little bit. Central Park has over 50 sculptures spread throughout it, one of a dog. The rest are men, except for Alice in Wonderland and Mother Goose. There is not a single statue, there wasn't a single statue of a woman who'd ever been alive. So Meredith was hired to do a sculpture for the suffragette movement. And I was telling Fiona about it, and we came up with the idea of doing a book of short stories that all take place on the same day during the largest suffragette march that had ever been held in New York City. And while we were in the airport, we came up with our wish list. We had about 50 authors on the list, but we started and in order of who we wanted, actually. And we started talking about what the stories might be and what kind of book it would be. And then we got on the plane. And while we're on the plane, we're texting each other. We weren't sitting next to each other, but we each had our phones on and we had internet. So we were doing all this Googling about all the parades in New York and which one should we pick. And by the time we got off the plane, we picked the parade. Fiona came up with the title. While we were walking to luggage, I screamed, never a good idea in New York at an airport. And the book was born. We called our agents on Monday. So that all like happened on a Friday. We came up with a proposal over the weekend. We called our agents on Monday. They said, let's do it. We started calling the authors, and literally within 5 days, every author on our list who we had called said yes, and we never got to the rest of the list. So there's actually enough people on that list to do 3 other suffragette parades. So that's how we came up with it. We sold it incredibly quickly also. It was the kind of book that nobody wanted to publish during the election. Everybody was worried about books coming out during the 2020 election, but our publisher thought that this was the one book that you could publish right before the election because it was about a parade to get women the vote. So we were very lucky, and the book was bought by Holt, and we have a wonderful editor, and everybody wrote their stories, and it was an incredibly wonderful experience.
It was so seamless. And what was nice about it is it kind of coincided with the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. So it felt like it was very timely, especially around the 2020 election. And yeah, we were amazed at how quickly it came about. And so the parade we chose was in 1915, and it was 25,000 people, men and women, marched up Fifth Avenue that day. And what we did is we came up with kind of a fact sheet about the day. So how many people marched, it was cold and windy, what the weather was, what time it started, where it ended, what time it ended, so that everyone's story might be coming at the parade at a completely different angle, yet it would still feel like a cohesive whole. And another idea that that actually our editor came up with was to create kind of a through line for it. And so we came up with the idea of a child who gets lost during MJ's story and weaves her way through a few of the stories, not all, and then is found at the final story. And so, you have this child popping in and out, which MJ can talk about as she talks about her story. And it was just, the reaction to it, the critical reaction was beyond our expectations. It was pretty amazing. And so I thought maybe now we'll turn to each panelist's individual story. If you can tell us kind of, maybe start with you, Alyson. What was your response when we approached you? And then can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. Well, I think when both you and MJ approached me to write a possible story for this anthology, I was overjoyed, not because only because it was such a great idea and there was such a wonderful list of authors who were coming on board, but also because it was a sort of zeitgeist moment of how important the vote was. And, we were gearing up for this 2020 election, and how the vote wasn't something that was just handed over to women, that women had to fight for that. And this sense to remind people, especially women, how important that vote is and to not take it for granted. So for me, it was a wonder, and I'm sure so many of the other authors, to sort of channel that enthusiasm, that respect for the women who fought before for this vote, to pay homage to them, and to create a story that did that highlighted, all that was, endeavored to get the vote for women. So typically with all of my books, I always try to have a protagonist that has some sort of artistic talent. I think that is something that comes about because I am the daughter of an abstract painter, and I myself am a frustrated painter. I originally thought that I would be a visual arts major in college, but then I took my first art history course and sort of fell in love with telling the story behind the painting, and also exploring how artists create and put things in historical context and the clues within a painting. So I guess I sort of, my career path changed when I was in college, because I loved those different layers that go into creating a work of art. So I started to think, well, who will be my character in this wonderful anthology? And I looked back to my own family history. I'm part Hungarian, and on my mother's side, my great aunt was in one of the first classes at Hunter College in New York. And although I have no evidence that she herself was a suffragette, it may really kind of emboldened me to imagine her during this time period. She also was sort of a dilettante painter. And so I chose Emma Kling, who really is my great aunt, to write about, weaving in my family's story of coming from Hungary into the text. And this sort of age-old relationship between parents and children, when the children are creative and the parents worry that they're not going to be able to support themselves, or in this case, a woman wanting to be an artist was, even more, incredibly bold than it is in modern times. So I wanted to work with that. And so I created Emma to be a daughter of Hungarian immigrants who wants to be a painter, who enrolls in the Art Student League on 57th Street in Manhattan, much to her parents' worry, her father's chagrin, and gets drawn into the suffragette movement through a colleague of hers at the school, a fellow art student by the name of Millie. And wanting to weave in true life history into my story, there was a poster contest that during this time that was organized by an artist who also had been at the Art Student League by the name of Ida Sedgwick Prosper. She herself had studied in France, had come back to New York, and had really become very passionate in the suffragette movement. And she sponsored a $50 prize, which even today, if my children got $50 for an art poster prize, they'd be thrilled. So she sponsored this for something for her newspaper, The Woman Voter. And so that's part of my story too, not to give away too much, but it really shows how an artist who has a day job at an advertising agency, where her artwork is being basically stolen from her, and she doesn't have a voice, she doesn't get any credit, is really inspired to become more courageous as this movement takes foot in New York, and her growth and her, what happens with the poster, we'll see if you read the book.
Thank you. It's such a beautiful story. I adored it. And Dolan, can you tell us a little bit about what was your kind of initial reaction to being asked to be part of the anthology, and then how you went about creating your story, which is so powerful?
Thank you. Well, I was so delighted to be invited with this, first of all, illustrious roster of writers, people whose work I admire and have been reading for years. So my first reaction was really just gratitude for you all inviting me. And then when you told me the idea, I thought it was a fantastic idea, because I live in Washington, D.C., and I had been at the Women's March in January of 2017. And I've lived in DC for over 20 years. I'm not a native, but I've been here over 20 years. And that was the most invigorating, energizing, momentous march that I've ever attended. I took my daughter, You know, we were down there so long, my cell phone died. As you know, when your cell phone dies, you feel like you're alone in the world. You don't know what to do. And it was such a display of women's solidarity and energy that when you approached me with this idea, I thought this is a really important moment to be thinking about it, especially after reading all of the signs down there with women having signs that said things like, I'm too, you know, I'm such and such years old and I'm still marching for this. So there were lots of things like that on the sign. Signs alone were a book, I'm sure. But you know, I just thought it was a great moment to be thinking about this. Then I began to research the parade itself. I didn't know a lot about the New York City parade, and I couldn't find any evidence of Black women having been there. And as MJ and Fiona will tell you, I emailed them and they had given us sort of a list of sources. I was going through the sources. They were very supportive of me going on this search and feeling committed to writing a Black feminist experience of this moment. And I did not want to make it up. There are times where I make things up as a historical novelist, lots of times where I make things up. This was a moment where I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to insert them into that parade if there was no evidence that they were there. I knew just from my own reading that there were many times when the white feminist movement and the Black feminist movement were parallel movements, and there were other times where they intersected. The New York City parade was not a moment where they intersected. So the moment where they did intersect was the Washington, D.C. parade of 1913. So I reached back out to Fiona and MJ, and I really have to say, y'all were really receptive to everything that I was coming up with, and asked them if I could instead do a reflection on the 1913 parade, which I think was quite momentous for Black women suffragettes, and they were completely on board with that. And so I stretched a little bit there, but not too far, because some of the same people who were involved in the DC parade were also at the New York City parade. And I was also able to capture, my character is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who I've always been fascinated by, and see her as a sort of ancestral mother. She spent some time in my hometown in Memphis, Tennessee as a journalist. And I was just very interested in where were Black women in 1915. They were doing things at the local level in the state of Illinois. Ida was living in Chicago. Women did have the right to vote already, as you know. In certain states, women had been granted the right, and she was canvassing for local politicians, and Black women had made a difference in several local elections in Cook County, Illinois, and she was trying to make sure that that stake, that constituency, was being rewarded for its efforts. And so she was working at the local level. I assumed that she read the newspaper. She was a journalist after all. She knew the New York City parade was going on. She knew that they were not there. She knew that it was a moment that, you know, she was not a part of. I wanted to sort of capture that feeling of not being there, but also the memory of the one she had been at, which was the Washington, D.C. march. So, yeah.
Which was pretty momentous, that what occurred there and what she did, and which is all encapsulated in the story, of course, as a flashback. But yeah, I thought you managed that just brilliantly and brought
And
to life.
also how awful it was. And it was so important to have you write the story, because we were really, I was shocked when I started doing the research, not just that there weren't African-American women, but there were Jews who weren't allowed, and Irish women weren't invited. And I was sort of surprised to find out how these women in New York, who were trying to get the vote for all women, how you know, bigoted and anti-Semitic they were. I had not expected that. And so I thought that your story was so important, because it really showed that part of it. I don't think I think we tend to want to think of the movement and every part of it as wonderful and fabulous, but there were aspects of it that weren't.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so MJ, do you want to tell us a little bit about your story? And if I can just add, anyone who wants to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll go through those starting at 4:30. So please include your questions below.
Sure. I had been doing research for a book called Tiffany Blues, where I had read a lot about Charles Tiffany, who was Louis Comfort Tiffany's son, Louis Comfort Tiffany of the stained glass lamps. And Charles Tiffany had taken over Tiffany's when his father died. And he had married a woman named Katrina Tiffany. And Katrina Tiffany, along with Fiona's character, was one of the true founders of the New York movement. They were called the Mink Brigade. And they were very wealthy women. And the movement in New York wouldn't have happened without them because they funded the whole movement. And Katrina was from college. She went to college. She graduated from college, and she was always a feminist and a suffragette. And she married Charles Tiffany when she was in her 20s, and he was anti-suffragette. And I thought that this would be a really fascinating aspect of the movement to cover, because we were going to have men write stories about men who were pro-suffragette movement. There were very, very many men who were instrumental to the movement. But I also thought it was important to have a story where we saw what was a marriage like when the people in the marriage had diametrically opposed views. And Charles Tiffany had married her knowing who she was and been in love with her because of her verve and her interest and her political powers. And yet he couldn't come around to this one aspect of it. So that was one aspect of the story that I was very interested in. And the other aspect of it was that there's a character in my story, another character who's also real, named George Coons. And George Coons is probably the most famous gemologist in America. He worked with J.P. Morgan to discover morganite, which is a stone. He also discovered kunzite, which is another stone. And probably the most important thing, other than everything he did for Tiffany as a gemologist, was that it's J.P. Morgan's gem collection that started the gem hall in the Museum of Natural History. And all of those gems had been collected by George Coons. George Coons was also a suffragette, and he created jewelry for women suffragettes out of peridots and amethyst and pearls that was not part of Tiffany, were not sold at Tiffany's, and were again very much against what Charles Tiffany wanted done. So I thought it would be interesting to contrast this very real world of a woman who helped start the movement, her husband who's against it, and the man who works for her husband who's openly and secretly helping support the movement. So it was really fun to write about all these real people. And Grace, who Fiona mentioned. Grace, I have as their imaginary niece. They were a childless couple. So it was easy to invent a niece for them who gets lost in the parade and then wanders around as different of our wonderful authors bump into her until she comes to a happy ending in Fiona's story.
Yeah, so my story also is part of the Mink Brigade, and it's from the point of view of Alva Vanderbilt. And she became interested in the suffrage movement in 1909 after going to London and being very inspired by what the suffragettes were doing there. And her second husband had passed away, and she was quite heartbroken. And so she really threw herself into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And, if she were around today, she would have been a PR maven who was unparalleled. She did crazy things for someone of her stature as a very wealthy lady of high society, including she opened up her Newport mansion to the public to raise funds, and charged people admittance, and much to the chagrin of all of her neighbors. She opened these street front suffrage clubs and lunchrooms where people could come and get literature on the movement. But at the same time, although she was very passionate about women's right to vote, she was a woman of contradictions. She was really a mix of old New York and new New York and the new woman. And so she thought the idea of marching in a parade was just a terrible idea. To her, that was like being a streetwalker, and it should not happen. And so the early parades, she was just furious at the idea of doing it. And she would pretend to be sick, or she'd get in her car and ride behind it in her car with her chauffeur driving it. And she finally marched, and she described it as a terrible ordeal, but she finally made that step and started marching. And so I decided to use that 1915 parade as that moment when she steps off the curb, and get into her head as to, what compelled her to finally do that. And of course, bumps into Grace, who's this very young girl, who kind of drives her mad because she's insouciant. And so it's a really fun pairing and a fun thing to include in the story. And so why don't we go back to Alyson now? If had you written a short story before, and what kind of research did you have to do to write the story?
So I had been involved with an anthology before called Grand Central Station, or Grand Central Stories from Grand Central, Stories of Post-War Love, I think it was, with a group of 9 other best-selling historical novelists. And that was the sort of brainchild of the novelist Christina McMorris, who wrote Sold on a Monday. And it was her idea to bring together 10 authors who would create characters that passed through Grand Central Station in New York on the same day in New York, right after World War II ended. And so my character for that, again, was someone creative, not an artist, but a musician who's a buster who plays the violin every day in the same spot and falls in love visually with a young woman who commutes to work every day, who happens also to be a dancer. And he plays different songs from around the world, hoping to get her attention, to see what her heritage is. And there's the backstory of who she really is before she collides with him, and their story begins. So for that book, I worked with violinists to make sure that my character was musically represented accurately. But then also I was really lucky enough to meet a 90-year-old dancer from that time period who had been doing all the different types of dancing at that time, and the training and her commute and how she was paid and all of her agent representation. I did that type of research, but a lot of the soul of the character I drew upon from my research from The Lost Wife. I have a character who flees Europe, not because of the Nazis. He comes prior to the Nazi invasion to the United States, but comes for the pogroms, and his family has, suffered in Poland in the 1920s. So he comes here as a child. But the research very much was trying to create a backstory of, how and why he emigrated to the United States, and also for the female character as well. So that was my own, that experience. And I did write a short novella, but that's much longer than a typical short story. It was, about the time of Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince, his time on Long Island. That's called a splendid gift. And that was to sort of coalesce with my book, The Garden of Letters, which has a sort of a storyline that involves the book, The Little Prince. And I learned when I was researching that book that Saint-Exupéry actually rented a house. I'm on the water in Huntington Bay, and his house is across, like what I look at, and the house still exists. And so it was really wonderful to be able to draw upon my own sort of everyday landscape and bring that into the book.
And what did you do were you able to chair the Art Students League for the short story in Suffragette City at all?
I have been inside the Art Students League before. My mother actually took classes there in her youth. And I actually think my grandmother did too, I think, if I'm correct. And now I still walk, you walk past it when you're, near Nordstrom's. Now when I look at it, I'm like, oh. But for this story, I just used my own memory, and then, pictures that I could see of the studios of how they were represented at that time.
Okay, great. And Dolan, how about you? What kind of research did you do for this particular story? And are you familiar, have you done short stories before this?
I'm not a big short story writer. I mean, you know, my natural length is the novel. I try to write short stories, and they always want to go long. Um, but I've had a few published here and there, and I like writing short stories. I teach writing short stories, so I should know how to do something. But I think it was a challenge. It was a welcome challenge to write a story for this anthology. I did a lot of newspaper research. Um, there was a journalist from the Chicago, I think it was the Chicago Tribune, who traveled with the Illinois delegation to the march in Washington in 1913, and that journalist wrote up everything that happened. So I had a pretty reliable source for what happened that day. I also, there was a pamphlet that was the official pamphlet of the parade. And that's where the title of my story comes from. It was something like Notes on American Womanhood. And so I used that pamphlet, and I also used it in a scene in the story that I made up, but it was based on the actual official pamphlet of the parade. So I think, you know, for us historical novelists, primary sources are always the best. Any, you know, letters, I did find, so, you know, Ida B. Wells has her papers. I looked through them a little bit, but not too in depth. But also just looking at what was happening in Chicago at the time, what was happening with her. She had a suffragette club in Chicago called the Alpha Suffragette Club. And so I looked at their notes. So yeah, primary sources, newspapers, that gave me a lot. I mean, if it had been a novel, I would have gone deeper into her papers, but it was enough for a short story.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. And MJ Rose, how about you? You and I were both working on novels set in that time period at the time, which I think gave us a boost. Do you feel that?
Yeah, that was one of the really easy parts of the, I don't write a lot of short stories, and I find them really difficult because I might as well be writing a novel for all the research I feel I have to do. So I knew the time period pretty well, but what was very frustrating is, like Dolan, I really like primary sources. And for all of Katrina's importance in the movement and who she was and what a big figure she cut in the movement, there was practically nothing written about her. I found a couple of letters that she wrote to her nephew and to try to get a sense of her personality. But it was very frustrating. I mean, I found like where she went to college, you know, what she studied, what sports she did. But for actually like listening to her voice, it was very hard to find anything. And that was frustrating. I had a much easier time with George Coons, who happens to have written about 30 books himself. And he's a really colorful, fabulous character. So he deserves a novel and a biography all of his own. But the other thing that was really fun for me, because I was writing about Tiffany's and a jeweler and a gemologist, was I did an enormous amount of research into Suffragette Jewelry, which is something that existed both in England and in the United States. And you can go online and Google Suffragette Jewelry and see just the most incredible, fabulous pieces of jewelry, all peridot, amethyst, and pearl. And it was sort of a secret sign to women to use for each other to identify themselves. You could wear a brooch that looked like just a beautiful pearl, amethyst, and peridot brooch, and it didn't mean anything to anybody who didn't know. But if you knew that that was your sister that you were looking at. So that was really an especially fun part of my research. I write a lot about jewelry. I'm currently working on, I think, my 5th book that has a jewel or a jeweler or jewelry at its heart. And it's a particularly wonderful topic to research because there's just a lot of beautiful things to look at and a beautiful world to immerse yourself in. It doesn't have too much ugliness attached to it, which in this world that we live in, I find I need beautiful escapes a little bit more than I used to.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, for me, it's the same thing. Was when you're trying to do research for a woman who's more of an ordinary woman in the world 100 years ago, it's so hard because there's no sources, whereas men tend to leave behind quite a trail. which can be very frustrating. But luckily for Alva Vanderbilt, there's been biographies written on her. There's a wonderful book out called The Gilded Suffragists, which talked about Alva and some of the other women who were involved in the movement. And that was very helpful in getting details that are great. And then, again, I love going to first person resources. So I was looking at old magazines, women's magazines from the 1910s, just to see what people were thinking about. And the whole thing was the new woman. And that's a woman who wants to support herself and have the right to vote and involved in women's rights. And I forgive if anyone watched the earlier interview I did for the festival. But one of the things I talked about was going through this old Harper's Bazaar. And on one page was an amazing essay about the importance of the new woman and women finding strength and getting together to, move the movement forward. And then on the other side of the page was the latest fad diet, which was called the barrel diet. And it involved getting a barrel and taking off either end and festooning it with ribbons, and then crawling inside and rolling around on your bedroom floor until you were sweaty. and it was an entire article with illustrations all about it. And for me, it just hit home the mixed messages that women have gotten over the ages of, okay, be strong and independent, but you better look good. And so it's just interesting to go back in time and see that these cycles just happen over and over and over. So that was what I tried to bring to that story. Let's see, we have about 10 minutes before we go to questions. Again, feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A. And MJ, what was kind of the challenge for doing this anthology with multiple authors? And can you talk a little bit about what our editing process was like?
Sure. So the first challenge was we wanted to give every author, they're such wonderful authors, we wanted to give every author a lot of freedom within this framework of just write something that takes place on this day. And that was really the only parameter. We didn't want to tell anybody what they had to do. At the same time, you're very worried that two people are going to come up with the same thing. And I originally had wanted to write about Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was in the march, but Paula McLean wanted to write about Edna St. Vincent Millay. So of course, I gave the character to her. And then of course she changed her mind and wrote about something else. So poor Edna never got into the book. But one of the challenges was, I found it challenging nudging everybody. I hated doing that, and writing and saying, so do you have your character yet? Do you have your character yet? Because one of the things that we had to do, Fiona and I had to do, was we had to look at the group of characters, and we had to make sure that it was diverse. We didn't want 12 people who'd all been in the Mink Brigade. Equally, we didn't want 12 people to write about women who were working in mansions who were cooks, so we really wanted every story to be different. So there was a lot of juggling about, as people told us what they'd be writing about, making sure that there was, and there were so many different things. I mean, Steve Barry wrote about a lawyer who supports the suffragette movement, who's involved in a very thrilling story that's unlike any other story in the book, because there's actually like serious danger involved. And people wrote about their ancestors, wrote about immigrants that come from the countries that their ancestors came from. So there are two stories that have to do with orphan children. So there's a lot of variety. So that was challenging and exciting. And then the other thing that's fun to always mention, because people always want to know, is we didn't literally edit all these stories ourselves, because we were very intimidated by the people we invited into the anthology. And there was no way that Fiona or I felt capable of reading a short story and calling up Chris Bajalian and saying, well, the second paragraph on the third page is really kind of dull. I mean, that we were not going to do that. So we asked one of the parts of the process in choosing the editor that we chose and going with the publishing house that we went with was, when they interviewed us, we interviewed them, one of the things we made sure is that they would be willing to be the quote unquote editor, to actually talk to each writer about problems with their stories and suggestions. And as it turned out, we were working with such an illustrious group of authors that his edits we could have done them based on how they were tiny. They were like, there's a word missing in this sentence. There were no real edits. So it was another part of this book that was so seamless. It all just kind of seemed like it was meant to be.
Yeah, the quality of the stories as they came in was just incredible, just one after another. And that's when the excitement just went through the roof, knowing what we'd be presenting to the world. I'm just going to ask Alyson and Dolan, what do you hope the anthology offers to readers? What do you want readers, say your daughter, to get out of reading the anthology? Alyson, do you want to go first?
Well, it's funny, before you said like your daughter, I was answering in my mind, and I thought, when I was writing this, I was writing for my daughter, because I know my daughter is unaware of the fight that women, committed to get the vote. And so I felt in my heart, as I sat down every morning, that I wanted to, to leave like a legacy behind somehow through this, our stories, to say, all the women who had come together, to fight for the suffrage movement, and to the right for, obviously the right to vote. So I guess, it was very personal. Even if you don't have a daughter, this, as what we've discussed before, this sense of paying respect and saying that it wasn't just given to us, that it was a tireless fight. And then to, all of us on this panel have woven in true life historical figures. I didn't know about Ida Sedgwick Prosper before I embarked on writing my short story. And so my first thing when I was researching was, what artists were involved in this parade, and who was Ida? What was her story to bring her to this moment and this parade? So learning of, that she grew up in the Midwest, and that she had to, fight her parents, so that she could travel to New York to become an artist. And then when she was in New York, she heard about the Impressionists, and she wanted to go to Europe, again, against her parents' wishes, to learn, plein air style of painting. For me, I was enriched by following her journey, and then how she gives back to her alumni at the art, I'm sorry, the Art Student League. I'm pulling for words like out of the ether, at the Art Students League by this contest. And so it was, this sort of merging of someone who was partly from my own family history, but then of course aspects of her invented, but then the true life person who is woven into the story with Ida's story. For me, that was paying respect to her, and to someone who, I felt an affinity to in her own personal story.
Beautiful. And Dolan, how about you?
Okay, so this is my copy here. And I will say that I just think this is a great book to have on your shelf. And I'm just saying, even as a reader, these are the kinds of, I love anthologies on my shelf. I think we're in a moment, I'll tell you, my reading has not been what it usually is this past year, partially because my kids are here and it's very hard to find a quiet moment. They're here all the time. But getting interrupted constantly, it's hard to read. And I just feel like I have been reading more short stories and more poetry than I ever have. And I'm also have like 6 half-finished novels I have not finished that I'm reading right now because I have a hard time. So what I would just say is that if you are, struggling with the attention of a novel right now, this is a great anthology, I think, to have. It's timeless. It's the kind of thing you can, because it's this historical moment, you can read it and you can buy it now, read later. But I will also speak to the daughter question. I have a 14-year-old daughter who loves history, who loves to read. Thank God. It's not a given. And I love this. I think she's only read my story so far. It's hard to get, she has to get there on her own. So I just put the books around the house and she picks them up when she's ready. But I think it's great because so many young girls her age, and my daughter is a typical DC kid. She's very politicized. A lot of her generation are politicized. She's quick to correct you on pronoun usage. She's very quick to correct me on a lot of things all the time. And I just say, I just want her to be informed. So if you're going to talk about feminism, know what feminism is, know what women did to get here, know a little bit about that backstory. It's not just sort of, no offense to TikTok, but it's not just a TikTok hashtag. There's been a hard battle fought over 150 years or more. And I want her to have some sense of that, so that when she's arguing with me, which she loves to do, that we can actually have a real discussion.
Absolutely. That's great. Wonderful. And Jen, I see you're back. Is it time for a Q&A?
Yes, I am back. So we've got a lot of questions that are coming in. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question, please use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So let's see. How was it decided to use the word suffragette for the title? And this person comments that was somewhat with a somewhat demeaning suffix instead of suffragist.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. So in London, the suffragists were called suffragettes as a kind of a demeaning term, ETTE, and they embraced it and said, all right, that's great, that's what we are. And so they called themselves suffragettes in London, whereas in America, the more common use was suffragist. And so for the title, because of David Bowie, we wanted to include Suffragette City somehow, and that just summed up New York City at that time so well. So that was where we decided to do that.
So now, why stories from 1915 and not 1920?
Because of the parade that we chose. This parade took place in 1915, and we wanted to be true to history. This was the largest parade there'd ever been in New York, and everybody felt that it was a real turning point for the movement. And there were over 100,000 people lining the streets, and it was a huge event, and it was peaceful, and it was written about in the New York Times. One of the really fun things that Fiona and I did before everybody got involved was we read a bunch of books, and we went to the archives of newspapers all over the country, and we pulled articles that had been written about this parade, and especially from the New York Times, obviously, since it took place in New York. And that was part of the packet that we gave everybody. And Fiona mentioned this book in passing before, but I'd like to take another chance to mention it. It's called The Gilded Suffragists. What is it called, Fiona? I'm terrible with names.
Yeah,
Gilded Suffragists. And it's one of the research books we used, and it's really an amazing book, based all true stories about the real women who marched and were involved in the movement.
And by 1920, the fight was over. It was a given. The political process of voting on it and getting it done was slow, but we wanted to kind of capture that dynamic period when people were still fighting, and it wasn't a done deal.
So how did you decide the order of the stories in this book?
That was actually the editor that we went with. Originally, my story was going to be first because of Grace being introduced in my story, but James felt that the story that he chose to go first, it happens before the parade. So it was very nice that there's a story that starts before the parade, and then I start the morning of the parade and introduce Grace, and then he chose the flow. And of course, Fiona, we knew that I was always going to be, if not first, second, and Fiona was going to be last, so she could tie everything up, and she could I start Grace and she ends with Grace. And that's also the reason that Grace's name is Grace. I mean, that was a very intentional name, because we felt that it was part of everything that happened on that day.
Would you consider publishing a second volume? Maybe, and this person says maybe with authors who were not part of the first one. I don't know if there are any other authors that you're like, I wish we'd, asked this person.
We've toyed around with doing a second volume based on something else with some of the other authors. So we'll let you know.
All right, good. So here's a question for Alyson and Dolan. How deeply did you inhabit the characters and world in your respective stories? Was it hard to reorient yourself back to present day reality?
It's a great question. Well, I think, personally, when I'm writing any story, I feel like I inhabit the characters. So for writing Emma's story, I very much felt that I was kindred with her. And since I mentioned in the earlier part of the chat that I'm the daughter of an artist. I had sort of a interesting battle with my own mother that even though she was an artist, she was not very supportive when I announced I wanted to go to art school when I was applying for college. And so I graduated college in 1994. So in 1990, when I was applying for college, she said, but how are you going to support yourself? And is it, I never been able to financially support myself through my art. And there was that worry about, how are you going to make it as a woman in the arts? So those situations in my short story between Emma and Elsa, and then how Elsa behind the scenes is massaging the father to sort of be like, well, maybe we do have to give her a try, maybe we do have to support her. And then the denouement of my story, I don't want to give it away, but when her mother really does, also become a woman of movement. So for me, there was a part of my mother I was writing for as well, when I was inhabiting Emma's story.
And I'll
Did
just
you read it?
Oh, sorry.
Did your mother read it?
My mother did, and my mother loved it. My mother actually really loved the character of Elsa. She felt that she loved the layers of her, and she loved the ending of the story. And I should just note that when I was creating the ending of my short story, one of the things that Fiona and MJ did for all the authors involved with the anthology was give us links to certain photo archival, things that are, so we could see the photographs of that parade. And there were these really magnificent costumes and crowns and togas that women were wearing. There were horses. And so I was able to sort of visually look at those photographs and then recreate what my character, sees as she's finally joining her compatriots in the parade.
And I'll just be brief because I know we have 7 more questions, but yes, I agree with Alyson. I try to inhabit all my characters. If it's a novel, which is, my jam, I spend more time and I feel like I inhabit them more fully than with a short story. But yeah.
So we have another question here. Would this be a good book for my 12-year-old granddaughter who's in 6th grade?
Yes, it's a safe read.
Yes. When my daughter was 13, she read it. She read my story. And I Dolan said her daughter is 14 and she's read her story. I certainly think it's a safe read.
Excellent. Okay, so Carol, you need 2 copies, one for yourself, one for your granddaughter. Let's see. So for Fiona, did you have to wait until all the stories from contributors were done before you wrote your story? And this person adds, I really enjoyed how you wrapped everything up.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't. I'm one of those people that I want to dive right in. So as soon as we had the idea and I knew it was Alva Vanderbilt, I jumped right into it. And what I did is I set her story in the late part of the parade. So it would make sense chronologically that that's near the very end of the parade. And then knowing that Grace, the 2 of them would find each other. And just by doing that, I think was just enough to give it an endpoint. I think if I'd said it earlier in the parade, it would have been confusing, but by making it at night as things are getting dark and the parade is winding up, it just worked as a natural closure.
How, and this would be for any or all of you, how were you changed in your relationship to women's rights by writing these stories? Who wants to start that one?
I'll start quickly. There were lots of things about this moment that I didn't know. That's the joy. The best kind of writing for us historical novelists is the writing that allows us to discover. And that's the fun of it, right? We fall down all kinds of rabbit holes that have nothing to do with the book. But the point is, the joy of it is discovering things. I didn't know much about either of these events. I knew a little bit. I had the image in my mind of the women in the white dresses and walking down the street and holding the banners, but I didn't know a lot. So I would say I was changed because I understood how tricky that path was for women to get that amendment. It was a tricky path. There were a lot of constituencies. I mean, one of the reasons why Black women were excluded is because the women had to bring on these Southern senators who were racist. And so it was a tricky path that took many years, going all the way back to Seneca Falls in 1848. And so I was just, I think I left with a new sense of respect for the political maneuvering and savviness of women that we don't often get the credit for. They had to be so strategic and so smart. And I guess I knew this from a sort of heart level, but after this project, I knew it in my head too.
Yeah, and for I love the way you put that. And for me, it was understanding that change is messy. And, there were violent acts going on, and people thought women would never get the right to vote. And you just have to soldier through. And it's can be very depressing at times, and change is not easy. But that in the end, the right thing can prevail. And that was very heartening for me, especially that year.
I mean, for me, I did go to a women's college, so I feel that I have always been very, drawn to women's movements and to feminism. But for me, writing this book really made me aware of the fearlessness of women who came before me. It's not a 21st century phenomenon. There's people who have been fearless throughout history, and really drawing courage from that too, like not to be afraid and to say when something is unjust, and to share that, and to not necessarily do it privately, but within your family, but to be fierce and to call out when there's injustice and there's inequality. So that's what I feel I've learned.
I actually didn't feel really changed. I was really angry when I started doing all the research, and I was angrier when I was finished. And then I got even angrier as we continued going on through the political 2 years that we had while we were working on this book. So it just reinforced everything for me. And I think it also made me very sad, more than anything else, at how much still hasn't changed. And that we're still fighting for so many of these things, and we're so at risk for so many of these things being taken away. And what's going on now in Georgia and all these other states where, I shouldn't be getting political, I'm sorry. Back to the book.
But you should be getting political, because that's
No, not at a book festival. You can do that another day.
Okay.
All right, we are running out of time, but let's see if we can fit in one or two, maybe more questions. So someone's asking, why a male editor?
They offered the most money.
There you go.
That was just arbitrary. That was just 5 houses bid on the book, and we went with the one that paid the most, and we liked them all, and it just happened to be a guy.
And Amy Einhorn was the head of the publishing house, and so we knew we were in very good hands. And and we wanted to make sure the authors got what they deserved for their time and effort.
Okay, maybe we'll wrap up with this one. What was the most inspiring and most challenging aspect in writing your story for this anthology?
I'll go first. For me, writing a short story at all and keeping it to a human length, because I really write very long, and so it was very hard to write it short. And also doing justice to the real women and men who were involved in it really was very difficult, because I really wanted them to be. Katrina was so heroic, and she worked so hard. I really wanted that to be part of the story and come through.
I think for me personally, the hardest challenge was within the framework of a short story, giving your characters a backstory and a soul without it getting bogged down too much in the front. So you want to, have an understanding of what draws this character into the movement, but at the same time, everyone's story, for the most part, takes place during the day of the parade. So with that time frame, it was a little tricky to be able to, I think, to give them that sense of their personal background and history, but also keep the momentum of what was happening that day.
Yeah, for me, it was doing justice to Alva Vanderbilt, who was such a complex woman and accomplished so much and had, great assets and also great faults. And trying to do that within a short story was very tricky.
I would say for me, it was just knowing who else was contributing to this anthology. I was scared. I was like, can I do this? The names, y'all. I mean, really, Alyson, you and all of you. And I knew MJ Rose's reputation was stellar, and I just wanted to do it justice.
You did.
You did.
More than did.
I have a coworker whose office is next door to mine, and he heard a lot about this anthology. I was in there talking to him every day.
Love it.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been a great panel. I see some other people are chiming on the chat saying the same thing, that they really enjoyed this. So thank you to all of you. The book is Stories from Suffragette City. Buy a copy for yourself, buy a copy for your daughter and your granddaughter, and buy it from an independent bookseller. So thank you everyone who attended.